Welcome back to Movie Recap. Today I'm gonna show you a 2013 Australian action drama film called Forbidden Ground. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The movie begins during World War I on the Western Front, wherein a British soldier named Arthur Wilkins writes a letter saying that he has seen countless men come to the place as their lives depend now on the battle. They leave them no choice but to survive as they risk fighting against the other soldiers. Then, Arthur also says that he feels like a lifetime has passed since he swore his oath to Grace, that he would return to her unharmed. However, upon writing, he eventually claims that it comes from his word, who died a long time ago. Meaning, whoever finds his diary after the war, would know who wrote the story. Afterward, he ends his narration by saying, Wilkins is all his answer to now. Later, the British corporal whistles to get them ready, while Arthur, on the other hand, remains sitting on the trench as he holds the notepad and pen. Afterward, the first troop of the British soldiers shouts as they fall in line in an attempt to shoot the enemies. However, while waiting for the signal, most of them show distress upon their faces, including Arthur. Then, as the explosions spread throughout the field, Arthur, on the other hand, calmly stares at the picture of the love of her life. He then says that he fears seeing her again because she might look into his eyes, and no longer see the man she loves, and that's what he fears the most more than the enemy and death. After, the corporal shouts as he signals the next troop to move and fight the enemy, when suddenly he gets shot through his head after blowing the whistle. Unfortunately, Arthur sees it, so he begins standing up, and takes the lead to gather the remaining soldiers. While walking, Private O'Leary calls him, saying that the lieutenant orders him to report to the command post. Afterward, Arthur walks on his way to the location when suddenly Rich Jennings talks to him, asking if he has done a runner. But then, Arthur answers, saying that it's a bit late for what he's hoping to see, and then, he orders Rich to get the men ready afterward. Arthur arrives at the campsite a minute later, and meets the lieutenant waiting for him. Afterward, the lieutenant walks as to make a word with Arthur, so Arthur immediately follows him. Then, upon getting outside the tent, the lieutenant opens up about the last bombardment that failed to do the job as he shows the evidence while they listen to the noise in the field. Unfortunately, most of their defenses are intact, so Arthur asks if anyone makes it through. To Lieutenant's dismay, he gives Arthur an answer of no while at the same, giving him hope that he'll have more success. However, Arthur shows disapproval, saying that a forward assault on those machine guns is a suicide. Yet, the lieutenant quickly makes a rebuttal, answering him that it comes from his order. Afterward, the lieutenant drops the information that the big boys will be smashing the lines again at 2100 hours if the Fritz still holds the trench. So, Arthur believes that delaying the next wave would make more sense. However, the lieutenant seems eager to follow his idea, saying that they will save the strategy for those who know best. Leaving him no choice, Arthur is getting ordered to take the trench, or he will get punished once he surrenders. After a while, Arthur gets back on their trench, and speaks with Rich, saying that he doesn't want any heroics out there, and will only keep the men moving. Principally, Arthur doesn't want his soldier to die upon taking the trench on the other side. Afterward, Rich brings his order while shaking hands with Arthur when suddenly Frankie tries to sneak out to see the enemy on the field. Refusing to listen to his colleague, Frankie gets shot in his head, then dies. Because of that, Arthur madly orders his men to move Frankie's body, and takes O'Leary with him. Upon positioning themselves, O'Leary suddenly asks Arthur if they even get a chance to stand. So, Arthur tries to reassure him, saying that it's okay to be afraid because he's a human. Then, before they move, Arthur warns them not to stop, and don't look back as they will be fine after accomplishing their mission. Afterward, the lieutenant signals Arthur to fix their weapons and load their guns. Seconds later, Arthur and his men move out after hearing the whistle as their signal. However, upon getting to the trench, most soldiers die in the field due to the explosive guns. So, Arthur moves to shoot the enemy who controls the artillery so that his men can run towards the trench. Then, on the other hand, Rich follows Arthur's tactic to gun down the soldiers to stop them from shooting their men. Unfortunately, there are other explosive devices that Germans throw upon the field, causing deaths to the running soldiers getting into German trenches. Because of that, Rich stops shooting, and immediately saves O'Leary lying down on the field after the explosion. Afterward, Rich and O'Leary continue their fight with the Germans when suddenly Arthur shouts their name to get back on their area, yet they both seem busy saving themselves on the field. Unfortunately, the rest of Arthur's men die at the battle while eventually passing out due to myriad explosions. Meanwhile, Grace suddenly dreams of her husband, Arthur, happily going home to their house despite getting crippled. Afterward, she excitedly hugs him, and walks with him through their garden. However, Grace eventually admits about the child in which Arthur is not the father. Because of that, Grace wakes up from her dream after getting slapped by Arthur. Unfortunately, Grace seems to be carrying a baby after holding her tummy upon waking up. Meanwhile, Arthur eventually catches himself in a cave at the trench with O'Leary and Rich, who survive the attack. Then, upon waking up, Arthur attempts to check if there are still any soldiers outside by raising a combat helmet. Fortunately, no gun shooting occurs, so Arthur crawls out and loads his rifle to shoot the soldier he sees from afar. Afterward, O'Leary suddenly attacks him as Arthur tries to wake him up. But then, Arthur successfully calms him down while the German soldier signals his men to shoot a flare gun cracker in their direction. Afterward, the lieutenant aide reports that he cannot see any action on the field, then asks what he is supposed the Fritz are shooting at. So, Lieutenant answers, saying that it makes no difference as he hasn't seen the foggiest, and pointing out that at 9 o'clock, everything beyond the ridge where Arthur and his men are staying will be nothing but dust. Afterward, he orders his men to move. Meanwhile, O'Leary apologizes to Arthur for attacking him as he begins panicking again about Private Franklin. O'Leary then says they should find him, hoping he's still alive, and can go home with him. However, Arthur madly answers him, saying that Franklin is already dead, and that he should stop talking about him anymore. Leaving him no choice, O'Leary agrees to follow Arthur's order and packs his things, giving himself no time to mourn anymore. Then, upon preparing themselves to find a new weapon, Rich suddenly calls Arthur's name to inform him that he's still alive and breathing. Afterward, Arthur and O'Leary quietly crawl out to find and rescue Rich. However, when they finally reach Rich's area, they see his right leg lacerated, requiring him to get urgent medical attention. So, Arthur reassures Rich that he will get him out of the cave as soon as possible, but then, Rich suddenly grunts after he gets pushed by Arthur, making the German sniper hear them. However, Arthur refuses to give up, and immediately forms an idea to give his gun to Rich so that he can control from grunting. Afterward, Arthur begins pulling Rich while O'Leary supports them from behind. But then, while gradually moving out, O'Leary suddenly falls onto the muddy water, allowing the German soldiers to shoot them from afar. So, Arthur quickly moves to pull Rich from the area as O'Leary saves himself from getting shot. Fortunately, they get safe as Arthur finally gets a lead where Fritz is shooting. Afterward, Arthur checks his military clock when suddenly Rich talks, saying that there's no chance that Arthur can drag him 400 yards through there. Unfortunately, Rich already thinks that Arthur and O'Leary stand a better chance without him. So, O'Leary gets an idea of getting help somewhere, but then Arthur gets mad, asking if he can bring the cavalry back to save them. Rich tries to protect O'Leary from an angry Arthur, but Arthur is eager to keep him, saying that they will not leave Rich no matter what. Leaving him no choice, Rich laughs, and favors to give him a minute as he tries to move his body. Meanwhile, the German sniper is still waiting for the three to get out. Then, on the other hand, Rich talks with Arthur about the memories he had with him during their battles. So, Arthur takes out his wife's picture as he begins telling their story. Yet, Rich refuses to continue his plan, and asks about his wife instead. Then, while Arthur and Rich are talking, O'Leary suddenly interrupts, and favors to see Grace's picture. Arthur then gives it to O'Leary, who eventually wishes that there is also someone who is waiting for him to get home. Meanwhile, Grace goes to a doctor named Dr. Bennett, in an attempt to abort her child. However, Dr. Bennett refuses to take his offer, saying that it is not suitable for her to take the surgery, and there is more risk at what she's favoring than is licensed to practice. Afterward, Dr. Bennett prescribes Grace, telling her that Eve will accommodate her about his health during pregnancy. Leaving her no choice, Grace follows Dr. Bennett's orders, and walks with Eve as they go to the room. Then, upon their arrival, Eve suddenly talks, trying to convince Grace to move away, have the child and adopt it. However, Grace refuses to listen and begins to panic, saying that once her family learns about it, they will disown her, and she will have nothing to come back to. So, Eve gives her advice, saying that Grace should not make any rash decision until Grace thinks it through. Fortunately, Grace gets convinced and leave, but Eve suddenly tells her that she knows someone to accompany her. Meanwhile, Arthur and O'Leary continue to pull Rich again when suddenly they see a flare crackle in the sky, causing them to lay down not to get caught. Afterward, they proceed with their mission to hide Rich as Arthur orders O'Leary to give the rifle. Then, after getting the gun, Arthur begins fooling O'Leary by commanding him to take the sling. To Rich's dismay, he asks Arthur when will the big boys light up because O'Leary might get killed once they continue attacking. Arthur then tells his reason, saying that he found him face first in the mud hiding like a coward, and assumes that O'Leary would sooner make a run for it than to stay with them and help Rich. Fortunately, Rich refuses to agree with him. He tells Arthur not to be too hard on O'Leary because he doesn't remember them getting particularly brave when they first got at the Western Front. Rich also says that O'Leary could have stayed out there, but O'Leary chooses to stay with them. Plus, O'Leary is only a boy, so Arthur should understand what he thinks and feels in the battle. Afterward, O'Leary suddenly gets back, and gives him the sling to bond Rich's lacerated leg. However, Rich fails to control from grunting, so the German shoots flare crackers in the sky again. Suddenly, the German begins bombing their area to kill them. But then, Arthur, Rich, and O'Leary safely avoid the explosion, and start moving out. So, the Germans finally see them, and begin firing towards their area. Unfortunately, O'Leary gets separated from Arthur and Rich, so Arthur immediately gets back and kills him. Fortunately, the three of them move safely and hide from the Germans. Meanwhile, Eve takes Grace to the house of her friend. While waiting, Eve tries to convince Grace to reconsider her decision because she might die from the procedure. But then, Grace seems unhappy about it, saying that she will probably suffer the same shame as Eve's sister if she keeps the baby. Grace then interrupts Eve from talking, saying that she has already made a decision, which is to abort the baby. Going back to the scene from the Western Front, O'Leary eventually realizes Arthur's by saying that he frequently observes him looking at his watch. Rich then convinces Arthur to tell the truth. Leaving him no choice, Arthur reveals that at 2100 hours, the big boys will be smashing the lines again. Shocked, O'Leary says that they can still make it in 20 minutes, and says that there's a medic's kit caught in the barbed wire not 10 yards away. So, Arthur agrees, and moves out with O'Leary to get it so that they can finally patch Rich's wound. A while later, Arthur begins crawling out to take the kit while O'Leary guards him against the Germans. Despite the intense mission to snap the wires, Arthur successfully takes it, and moves out as the Germans begin shooting again after hearing him. However, O'Leary starts to run without them afterward, allowing the Germans to shoot their ridge while the lieutenant suddenly realizes that he's part of them. Unfortunately, the lieutenant chooses to order his sniper to shoot him instead of saving him, but O'Leary dies from an explosion after getting into their trench. Unfortunately, only Arthur and Rich remain. Afterward, Arthur begins patching his wound using the medic's kit he gets earlier. While treating him, Rich asks the time they only have before the Fritz bombs their area. However, while finally getting out of the ridge, Arthur sees the air of gas coming on their way. So, he uses his urine to cover their nose, and prevent them from getting killed. But little do they know, the Germans are also coming on their way. Luckily, Arthur and Rich immediately move out of the ridge before the Germans see them. However, Arthur finds out about the Germans sweeping out the field, so he and Rich immediately crawl out while Lieutenant Men, on the other hand, also find out about the Germans' actions. Unfortunately, while Arthur and Rich are playing dead, one of the German soldiers walks towards Rich, and suddenly hits his lacerated leg, causing Rich to shout as the Germans begin gunning down their area. Afterward, Arthur eventually fights with the German soldier to kill him. Fortunately, Rich shoots him first before his friend, Arthur, gets killed. Arthur immediately carries Rich as they try to get out from the field full of explosions. The movie ends with Arthur successfully saving his friend, Rich, to reach their border while his wife, Grace, fails to abort the baby because Eve refuses to help her. However, before Rich finally gets home, he chooses to give up his life and dies on the Western Front. Morning, Arthur closes Rich's eyes as his cavalry suddenly saves him from the German who's about to get him killed. Then, after the battle, Arthur goes to Eve to give Rich's letter to her. But after giving it, he tries choking her after knowing that Eve accidentally kills Grace and their unborn child upon the procedure of aborting the baby. Yet, Arthur decides not to continue it, and visits his wife's grave afterward. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this to help the channel out. Have a nice day.